Hi, welcome. It's the Mend Podcast. Host Joe Roeder here from Red's Fly Shop. Again, this is your ad-free, BS-free fly fishing podcast where we try to stay on task talking about fishing. This is going to be a Tuesday's Tippets episode, and it's going to be a little different format. There may be a little background noise and maybe a little clunky. It's about 6:30 a.m. I am at home in a busy house tying flies right now. I'm guiding today, and coincidentally, my older son is going fishing today, my college son, and he wanted to tie a few bugs. So I kind of hijacked the vise from him. So I'm wrapping a few bugs, and yeah, so I'll kind of talk to you a little bit about tying just while I'm wrapping bugs. But historically, we didn't sell tying materials at Red's. We just never had the square footage in the store. And so tying wasn't really a part of our business culture. I still tied some, but wasn't, super motivated to tie flies and like share it. And just because it wasn't part of what I do for a living, fly fishing, making a living in fly fishing is hard. You kind of have to stay on task with what your business doesn't as good at. So didn't talk a lot about tying, but I do love tying, and I'm tying a nymph right now. But I think what I'll do is just kind of unpack, like, why, why I tie what I tie, when do I tie what I tie, and etc. So, like, when I started tying flies, I tied out of absolute sheer necessity. I'm not talking about just tying flies as a kid because I'm curious, about how to, tie my own bug and that kind of thing. Oh, I wish I had a video podcast right now because that fly is so sexy. Oh my gosh. Yeah, short of just tying as a kid and like learning how to, initially tie a fly. My tying was really out of sheer necessity. When I started guiding in the town where I live in Ellensburg, Washington, for those that haven't been here, that's in the east side of Washington where it's like, high desert, shrub steppe type terrain. There was no fly shops in this town. There wasn't a single fly shop when I started fishing here. And there was one shop when I started guiding, but it would have been non-cost effective. I worked for an outfitter at the time, and we didn't have a shop or a retail shop, and it would have been like completely uncost effective for us to like go buy flies, for our guided trips. And flies were just really expensive, and we weren't charging a lot for our guided trips back then, so it would have been pretty non-cost effective to do it. So the alternatives were, discount flight companies showed up at about that time. The internet was just becoming a thing where you could actually buy some stuff online, but we tied most of what we fished. And because of that, you were guiding long days, tying what you fished. You can't really, people say, oh, well, just tie all your flies in the off season. That really doesn't work, especially when you're a young guide. You don't really know what's going to be, hot or trending that particular season. I think my interest in flies change quite a bit from year to year and throughout the year based on things like weight, like weight of nymphs, the particulars of the pattern. And there's some years and some times that trout just prefer certain bugs versus other bugs. I don't have a biological explanation for it or anything like that, but you can't just tie all your flies in the off season. That just doesn't work. So anyway, so I tie a lot of short notice flies like I am today. I'm heading out guiding, and I really wanted a couple of really thin bodied, heavier nymphs. And so like the history of my tying, you out of here, buddy?
Yep.
All right. Good luck. Love you. So I wanted a couple of my younger sons taken off, go to school. Anyway, I want a couple of really thin-bodied but heavier nymphs because I want to be able to fish like a New Zealand style indicator in fairly deep water without any split shot or a bigger fly or anything like that. So I'm tying this is exactly like my tying MO is like, hey, I am headed out today. Here's what I want to do and what do I want to accomplish, like as far as my fishing style. Generally, my tying is done to complement my interests in fishing style. So, like, for instance, if I was wanting to trout spay fish today, It's not like I just sit down at the vise and be like, "Oh, I really wanna tie a trout spay fly." I'm like, "No, I really wanna go trout spay fishing, and now I need, some ammo to support that interest." And then, for a trout spay fly, for instance, I would want something really sparse probably so that it casts really well. My streamers anymore, personally, I fish a lot smaller streamers on average than I did when I was younger. I found smaller streamers to be very effective to not startle fish in the surrounding, part of the pocket if I want to refish something. So I'm not talking about just blasting downstream Montana style, pitching, giant articulated bugs at the bank. You know, it's a lot of fun. I'm not really describing that, but I'm describing streamer fishing where I might be on foot. That's my overwhelming interest nowadays is actually fishing on foot. So, like a smaller streamer, I can actually kind of work through a series of pockets or spend a little time in a bucket without telling every single fish in the zone that, hey, I'm here and you're under attack, like I would with larger streamers. So for instance, I'm going to tie what I need for that particular day or that particular outing, and I can do so really on short notice based on the conditions that I'm up against that particular day. So the other thing about tying is I've got to be able to have bugs that are pretty quick turn. So I'm going to time this bug. I'll try to describe it to you. So I've got one of these Umpqua X jig hooks, like in a 14, which is pretty big size for me. And then I got a 3.3 millimeter slotted tungsten bead. I have just put that into the vise, and I'm using. We sell a slightly different product. The shop is probably a lot better, but just a floss, like a unit floss, just a red unit floss. I tied some olive ones last night, but I kind of had a hankering to tie some red ones this morning. And I'm just going to run a single layer of floss behind that bead, and I'm going to run that just down to the bend of the hook, cut that floss off. Then I'm going to grab a piece of or not copper, silver wire, and I don't know what size the wire is. It's a little thinner than I want. I'm not very good at making sure I've got the exact size. So I'm going to tie that wire in the back end. I'm going to overlap it, and then I'm going to run my floss forward all the way to the back of the bead. Floss is nice because it's nice and shiny. And then I'm going to use this floss like you would on a zebra midge, just to create some little segments on the body, give it a little contrast. And I'm going to run that wire forward. And at this point, I've pretty much tied a zebra midge, more or less, literally 1 minute into the bug. Now, floss is kind of a pain in the neck. Some tires, in fact, some tires will switch from floss back to thread when they do this next couple of steps. It's really simple steps, but floss is just kind of fat. But you can spin your floss if you're a tire. You want to turn your floss into nice sharp thread that will bite and hold materials onto the hook. Just spin it a little bit. Little pro tip for you. And then I'm going to grab a piece of hackle, like just my dry fly hackle. So same stuff I use. It's just there's something shiny about it and just kind of creates a really good illusion on these nymphs, and it's really simple and easy to use. So I'm going to put a piece of that just dry fly hackle in there that's like a cinnamon brown. It complements the red nicely. And I'm going to tie that in kind of right behind the bead. And then I've got it's from, I don't even know if the company's still in business. It's basically just a really dark black, like a blackish peacock UV dub. I'm not super picky about it, and I'm going to spin some dubbing on there, very sparse because I need this fly to sink. And I'm going to put a tiny bit of dubbing behind that bead, very minimal wraps with that floss because that floss is thick and tends to build up. And then I'm going to wrap and palmer my hackle right through that dubbing. And the hackle I've been doing just like 2 to 3 turns. You do not want to overdress your nymphs. You want these things, a lot of hackle on a dry fly is great, but nymphs, we generally don't want a lot of material on there. We want those nymphs to really have a negative density and sink fast. And the more thread, the more crap you throw on there, the worse it gets. So anyway, I'm going to whip finish this thing, and that's even going slow and talking through there. And I made one little mistake that I had to undo. Yeah, flight took about 3 or 4 minutes. And I generally don't super glue or cement, a lot of my nymphs. I just tie them. Just tie them, finish them. And yeah, that's a beautiful looking bug. So maybe I'll throw that on Instagram or something so that you have it visual. But when it comes to tying flies, if you have tied flies in the past and maybe you've gotten out of it, what I'm noticing in my own fishing is that I am much more invested in the success of my patterns when I tied them in my fishing. I'm more concentrated. I fish harder. I'm more curious. I'm more likely to try different flies and change flies. And I think it really is refreshing and very interesting when I'm tying my own flies and then solving problems, like I said, for sink rate or buoyancy, trying different colors and that kind of stuff. So I had to break right there. I had to let my son jump on the vise. He's got to go to tie a few bugs, head to college, and then he's going to go down and go fishing. Unfortunately, I got a guide, but I might float down, and if I get done before dark, have him meet me at the takeout and then let him jump at the boat with me. Should be kind of fun. Anyway, it's good life. Yeah, so when it comes to like tying bugs, maybe you've tied a little bit in the past and you're trying to get inspired or motivated to get back into it. I'm hoping as we wrap up guide season, we get into the winter, my intention is to do a fair amount of tying videos in conjunction with the other staff members here. But most of my flies are very simple, very easy to replicate, not real complicated, very pragmatic. I am picky about like they need to be very symmetrical. They need to be very simple. And that's part of tying flies with very few ingredients. For instance, the nymph I'm tying this morning is floss body, and you can use this recipe to do an infinite number of color variations in it, but floss body, wire segments, a little bit of dubbing, and like 2 wraps of like a really glossy, stiff dry fly hackle. And I like CDC, but it's not as fast and efficient to use. And I feel like that, a really stiff, glossy Barbie hackle on a nymph isn't utilized a lot, but I think if you do it in a very conservative fashion, it just seems to reflect light as that bug moves down. Hackle is one color on one side, one color on the other, and it just seems to get bit. Maybe that's enough explanation for you. It just gets bit. And you can take that chassis, and I'll do a YouTube video of it at some point soon, but my fly tying setup is currently in my younger son's bedroom. So it's just a terrible place to try to film or document anything. So I'm going to set my fly tying desk up in another part of the house where I can actually do some real videos. But you could take that chassis and you can go anything from an 18 to a 12. You could add a tail if you want. I don't tie a tail into most of my nymphs just because the tails are, it's a great way to make your fly look. And I just was talking about being simple, but tying a really crappy tail on there is a great way to make a really good pattern not look so great. So I keep it super stupid simple, but that's what I'm literally up to at the very moment. I'm heading out guiding today. I fished yesterday and had a ton of fun, but I'm going to roll back. I can't remember when the last upload was, but I I sometimes I want to get like a lot of the people I fish with and stuff on the podcast, but the podcast isn't something that we do for a living, so it seems to take a backseat to a lot of the other chores, simply like fishing an extra hour during the day. But I fished in with my buddy Joey last week, and I try to reference things that are moments from these particular days so that maybe you have some context. But I put an Instagram video up last week of jigging mop flies, and that was from one of the days I was fishing with Joey. Fished a couple days with him, 2 days in a row, in fact, and caught a lot of really nice fish. I'll just kind of replay those days, but then we'll go back to the jigging mop flies thing, because then you can go watch that video and kind of see a little bit of context for what I'm describing. But the first day, he was wanting to get better at his tightline nymphing, and he's such a good fisherman that he picked it up really quickly. He already had his own rod, and he'd done a little bit of it and had some success, but he's a good enough fisherman that he employed me for a couple of days to give him some finer coaching and hit on the finer points of tightline nymphing. And the first day we stopped in a spot, and he ended up catching a really, really nice fish on a crayfish. And that I did put that on our Instagram story. I mean, really nice. I mean, 19 to 20 inch fish, just exceptional, like well above average, even for, a heavier fish, like exceptional. And caught it on a crayfish in really soft water, like very, very soft edge that would have been tough to fish with any other type of setup because it was just so slow. It would have been hard to keep like an indicator or anything moving in that real slow water. And you could bomb them with a streamer, but that's kind of a one and done thing. If they don't eat it, now they're aware, versus, sliding or drifting flies past them. I think fish are much more tolerant of that, and it doesn't raise their alarm. They don't hit the alarm quite as quick on drifting flies. So, yeah, he caught a big one of crayfish, and then it was just a dry fly bonanza after that. It was blue wing olives for the last really good day I'll see all year of blue wing olives. I mean, just crazy good dry fly fishing for a couple of hours. That was really, really good dry fly fishing. We've unpacked lots of technical dry fly fishing, so I don't really need to share any information about that. But then it was like a November evening, right? So then it's real dark, it's post-hatch. It could be really hard to catch fish nymphing. The streamer fishing was terrible. Joey's an expert streamer fisherman, and we sussed all that out, throwing streamers on long leaders up in the shallows, which is where the fish were essentially holding because of the dry fly hatch. They were kind of in some soft edges up in the shallows. Really great, light line streamer rod, light line, dry line, streamer rod pulling, buggers through the shallows. I think we got nothing. I mean, just dead. And then, to continue just, scratching the curiosity itch, Joey wanted to run like a mono yarn indicator rig. Like I just call it, tight line indicator fishing. So basically it's all monofilament, like a microliter rig, 2X all the way from, a strand of yarn, a tiny New Zealand indicator style. I just tie a strand of yarn in. I did a YouTube video where I outlined this not this summer before last, where I think I called it like the super slam strategy or grand slam of strategies. And one thing that I learned from a competitive angler is how to run a tight line indicator system. In competition, you can't use an indicator, but you can use like a chubby Chernobyl. And it sounds like the dumbest thing in the world until you try it. But basically, you can run a microliter, 5X or 4X is preferred, all the way from your indicator or your chubby Chernobyl, all the way back into your reel. And essentially, you have it's completely weightless. So you can run essentially a tight line all the way from your fingers in your rod hand out your rod all the way down to the indicator or hopper dropper if that was how you rigged up to a shallow nymph. And if you can picture this, that mono goes out and is taut, it's semi-tight, and so you're damn near feeling every strike where that fish floats up, grabs your nymph, pulls the indicator down. You're already tight and connected, so you miss almost no fish. Slack line, I'd say if you hook 1 and 3, you're doing really well on a given day. I mean, we're hooking, 8 out of 10. We're hooking 8 out of 10. Oh, my wife's trying to get my attention. Yeah, go for it. Go for it, honey. You're hooking like 8 out of 10 probably, on that rig. So it essentially you're tight line indicator fishing, and then fundamentally speaking, there is no mending. So you fire that rig in there, and and it fishes immediately. There is no mending. You don't disrupt the drift partway through, and it fishes pretty much instantaneously when you fire that in there. And I need to like go through and do an entire like podcast and or video on that specific technique. It's the fishiest thing I've ever seen. I don't do it a ton because I'm more often guiding than I am fishing. But when it comes to like working pocket water, especially in water that's a little high and swift, where the fish are really in some complex and technical currents that make mending difficult, if not impossible, it's an unbelievably effective and fun rig. you do it a couple times and you're like, oh my gosh, it's like calling, I would say, it's like calling, crossbow hunting archery. It is so effective. It's almost not right. But it has specific use cases, and that is we're not casting a long ways. We have technical currents, a lot of really swift, boily, eddy water, where that if you had fly line laying in those currents, they're going to get sucked under in the whirlpools. It's going to be impossible to mend. And then you're in these scenarios where the fish is maybe going to engage with the fly, and then it either does one of two things. Three things. Let's just pretend you threw into a very technical, boily piece of water, and you're like, oh, I need to mend, and so you mend it, and it puts the fish off. And maybe the fish is on the way to the fly, and then all of a sudden, your indicator gets sucked under by a whirlpool, and then you've got to like resurface it or do whatever it is. The other thing that happens is you get a false strike, where the current just grabs your nymph, pulls your indicator under because you have line on the water. When you have no line on the water, it's amazing what a small indicator can carry when there's no fly line or leader on the water. Because, say you're fishing a 10.5 to 11 foot rod with the rod high in the air, and then that line going straight to the rod tip, you're putting upward tension, very slight, mind you, but you're putting upward tension on that indicator at all times. And I'm not sure I've adequately described that, but if you can imagine just basically high stick nymphing with an indicator on the water and then a fine piece of tippet all the way, so you have no fly line out the rod tip. You really have to have a purpose-built rod, preferably a 10.5 to 11 foot 2-weight, even 3 weights oftentimes make that casting, that rig a little bit more difficult. So you really have to have a purpose-built rod for it. You have to be set up for it, but it's incredibly effective and really fun. I mean, when that indicator goes down and you meet the fish with a tiny flick of your rod tip, you're already tight to the fish and buried, into that trout. It is really, really a cool feeling. So that's the rig we set up on that afternoon to fish kind of that late afternoon and dusk time frame. And there's a transition in the afternoons right now where the fish go from feeding pretty deep. In the morning they feed pretty deep. They feed pretty, regularly on nymphs, and they're happy to feed, near the bottom. Trout aren't picking stuff up right off the bottom, but they will feed really close to the bottom. But late in the day when that sun gets low, they really have to see that food up above their heads. And so I specifically remember, it got dark. It was getting late in the day. The streamer fishing was terrible. And we ran that mono yarn indicator rig and a tightline yarn indicator rig and fished a very short stonefly rig. Like I'm talking 18 inches under an indicator, and fished it through the edges of a lot of deeper pools, and got several really nice fish late in the day. Whereas like the tightline nymphing was done, the streamer fishing wasn't happening, dry fly fishing had came and went, and suspending that small stonefly nymph up above their heads allowed the fish to see upwards, get a silhouette of that nymph, and then we were able to hold that nymph really steady, even in technical currents, with that kind of that mono tightline yarn indicator rig. Like I said, hopefully I adequately described it, but I'll try to remember to put the link for that video where I fish that setup in the description. In fact, I vow to do that. I will put that video in the podcast description. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff in that video. We try to catch fish on a big variety of different types of setups that day. That's what we called it, the strategy super slam. We're just trying to catch fish on a lot of different ways, which I always greatly enjoyed doing. Well, that was like midweek last week or late last week. And then the next day Joey and I went and fished the farmlands area in Ellensburg. And we just wanted to do something a little bit different and wade like it's more of a gravel fluvial type of stream. And versus the canyon, bedrock, big basalt bouldery stuff we were in the day before. So we're like, oh, let's mix it up a little bit. And we started that day, and I can't remember what we started with, but I was technically guiding, but with one of my buddies. And so I'll fish a fair amount. Once he's lined out, he doesn't need me sitting there telling him what to do all the time. So he'll invite me to fish, and so I'll fish a fair amount, when I'm just guiding a single angler on, when we're waiting. And so I was like, I'll go experiment a little bit and try different bugs. And I need to do an entire podcast about this at some point, but I had always heard how great mop flies are, how much fun they are, how effective they are for anglers really in that Euro nymphing and tightline community. Indicator fishermen can get fish using mop flies, but it's really a tightline, anglers, fly, or strategy. And I'd had very mediocre success, like, fishing my mop flies. I mean, I caught a few really, really big fish on them that I'm like, I wonder if that fish would have eaten anything but that, because it's just a big, smart fish, like a 7-year-old, trout out here. But I never really cracked the code, never really had great fishing. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to fish this mop fly. And I had talked to an angler in the store that I've mentioned on the podcast a bunch. And if he ever comes back in or reaches out, he's from New York and he was road tripping out to California and fishing his way out. But if he ever comes to the store again, I'm gonna drag him onto the podcast, because I've referenced a few of the things that I learned in discussion with him. And I can't tell you how important it is to be a good listener. The longer I fly fish, the more I realize that I'm picking up little ideas and things from people all the time and executing on them. But he asked me how much are you jigging your mop flies? And I mean, I would say I wasn't even consciously jigging them. I was just kind of leading them, putting tension on them, and that I would just assume that because I was bumping into a rock here and there, that the fly is giving that it would induce action on the fly. And it wasn't the case, because he's like, man, you got to jig those a lot. He's like, you really got to get after it. He kind of gave me a little charades, demonstration in the store of him jigging, which was actually really helpful. And so last week I got out and I started jigging a chartreuse mop fly on some of the really soft, deep edges. Deep being, say, 4 feet of water. We're not talking about the abyss here, but you started consciously jigging these flies and doing so in water that probably would have been hard to get an indicator drift because of the really sluggish currents. I mean, in slow currents, your indicator drifts that's why people tend to do so much better in faster water. It's not just because there's more fish there. There could be, there might not be, but it's because your flies are easier to sell to the trout in swifter water. So we start trying to fish some of that real soft stuff with an indicator rig, and it just looks phony. I mean, the fish can see the line hanging down if you're not running light tippet. If you've got 2 flies on there, it looks extra phony. All of a sudden, you go into that soft edge and you put a fly on the bottom and then move that fly. It can be incredibly effective. So not only was I fishing a new technique, on one of my Euro rods, but and I got to actively move the fly, which is really fun, and I got to snap jig it. And then the way the fish take on that fly when it is being moved and wiggled along the bottom like a grub, I think that the fish, it's not that the bug's going to get away, but I think that the fish they have a competitive nature. They see that big opportunity or that prey, and it's almost like they're racing to it to tackle it. So it was a really fun experiment. We caught a good number of mature trout jigging those mop flies on those weak edges, and it was really eye-opening even after all these years of fishing the same river. In fact, I can't quite see the river from my house, but I can see the valley right there, but I'm looking out right toward where we were fishing that day. I've been fishing here a long time, and that is completely new strategy for me. So it was really fun to kind of engage in that this last week and jig those mops. And we jigged some leech-style flies and some streamers and things like that. But I think it taught me not to overlook some of that really weak water. In fact, at one point, there's a lot of leaves coming off the trees right now, but there was one spot in a backety where all these leaves had been piling up, and Joey kind of walked past it because he's like, I'm not going to fish, right up against the leaf pile. So the leaves are underwater and accumulated in the backety. And I was like, I was just the guide that day, just fishing behind him. and experimenting with new flies, trying to find an angle for it or strategy angle for us. And so I was like, I'll fish right off the edge of that leaf pile. I'll put that fly on the bottom in there and jig it around. And I caught one of my best fish of the day right off the edge of a big accumulated pile of leaves underwater in a week back eddy. I mean, I can't think of another way I could have caught that particular fish because I put the fly into very soft, slow water, and then I was actually able to agitate and move the fly to trigger a strike from the trout. So yeah, super satisfying. I'm still kind of giddy about it. I was really, really thrilled to, make these new discoveries or a new discovery in my game. So I just picked up one more skill. I can't wait to start doing it with a larger variety of patterns as well. There are a lot more leeches in most of these Western streams than people realize, and that will be a great way for me to imitate leeches and my stonefly nymphs. I do agitate my stonefly nymphs and my crayfish, but I'm going to do that a lot more and learn how to do that even better and better and better because the average angler and let's say the guide boats, they are not fishing that type of strategy. It's just not happening. You have to be really patient and you have to be in a lot of control, and you do have to fish a very, very light tippet. Not only so the fish don't see it when it's, hanging all the way down through that slow water, but lighter tippet adds way more control because the current can't get a grip on razor thin tippet, whereas the current can get a very good grip on, say, 3X or 4X. By the time you get down to 5X or 6X, when you jig that fly, it's just you and that fly without the static interference of that current pressing on tippet. And it makes a huge difference. The more I've done this, the more I'm really just running 6X almost exclusively now for the most part. So yeah, it was super fun. And then I'm going to briefly unpack yesterday's outing. I got out with Shannon and Ashton. Those are our guide gals at Reds, and it'd been a minute since I'd gone out fishing with either of them, but we planned to go fishing a bunch and like 4 times just got run over by reality and something came up. But I got out with the girls yesterday, kind of an end of season, just, fun trip. And God, I got to tell you, fishing with them, they goof off and have more fun and have a better time fishing, seems like, than anybody I've been around in a while. I mean, they just pure joy and they can both fish. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So we ended up catching a few on dries right off the bat. We didn't even start fishing till about 1:30. So we only fished for about 2.5 hours, 3 hours, maybe. Got a few on dries. I did get one jig and a mop fly right off the bat. And then I was like, I'm good. So I ended up putting that rod away and the girls got into them on dry flies. Yeah, so girls got into them on dry flies, and then we threw some New Zealand rigs. And I was I think their first introduction to really like, hey, here's yarn is good for indicators and here's why, because they both ate it up. And in case we don't get to a podcast with them soon, I'll just add some of their comments about, I was like, hey, let's throw yarn on there. But I think their comment was that the line speed difference between fishing yarn and like an Oros, which is what Ashton, typically uses. Shannon fishes on the Natchies, guides and fishes the Natchies River almost exclusively. And so she doesn't indicator fish hardly at all. I mean, that's a dry fly, hopper, dropper river almost exclusively. But yeah, I think that the line speed difference was something they really noticed. They're like, oh my gosh, this is so much faster, to move around the river, you want to grab an extra 15 feet, like the line speed you can get with a fairly sparse yarn indicator, the line speed and like distance recovery you can get there's just an infinite number of advantages. Ease of use is not one of them. Convenience is not one of them. I build my indicators pretty much fresh every day. But as far as tactical, fishing advantages, yeah, the advantages are great. Do I think that everybody should use them? No, I think you should find your own kind of strategy. But yeah, fishing with the girls yesterday, they were like, oh my gosh, this is so much better than, pitching bobbers. Now, there were times for bobbers and things like that, but like yesterday's scenario was like, it's like, okay, I can see why, you're hooked on the yarn stuff. But yeah, girls caught a bunch of fish. You put a good post on Instagram. You can see a bunch of photos from the trip. Just posted that today. And yeah, so yesterday was my last day out. And I'd say strategy wise, takeaways that I had was it felt like an overhand mend was really critical to just set up that drift and get it to hold steady on the indie rigs. Getting that drift to hold steady for an extended period of time in these more open seam lines and open drifts that we're dealing with as we approach winter water. So that's a Tuesday tip. It is like learn how to mend high and light with that rod tip well above your head in a roll cast style fashion so that you could actually gain control of that drift and mastery. If you just simply mend your line upstream, that's not going to be enough. You actually need to mend your line away from you out toward that indicator and have really good control if you want to become a master of controlling an indicator. So like high and light, rod tip above your head, and there's a method of casting. If you're casting upstream, for instance, casting upstream, getting a little slack, drawing that rod back into, poising it back into a roll cast position, and then using the rod tip to flick that slack line out and up from that indicator. And it's a beautiful thing to watch when it's done right. That seemed to be like part of the reason we were able to pick up some of the really good fish that we did yesterday was just simply holding a steady drift in some of those open seams, which is way harder to do than it sounds like because fly lines inherently drag. So yeah, that was a big takeaway from yesterday. And then again, evening time, short line nymph rigs, keeping that fly, mid-water column and just trusting that the fish will float up and get it really seemed to be very helpful as well. So those were, just a couple of takeaways from yesterday. Dry fly hatch here is just dwindling and almost done. We did not see a lot of rising fish yesterday, but we did get a few. So as far as upcoming events and things go, just keep watching our website. Sign up for our newsletters. If you haven't done that, we are going to have a fly tying rendezvous at some point this winter or spring, early spring. We do want to have a tying rendezvous. It'll be fun and casual. I would say that's probably the only noteworthy event coming up. Our fly fishing film tour last week was absolutely awesome. Raised some money for Washington Water Trust. Had a good time with a whole bunch of customers, some of our staff members. Congrats to everybody who won awesome stuff at the film tour, and the films were great. Always a fun time being able to do that. So anyway, I'm signing out. I'm going to go guiding today. Hoping to have a great day, and we will catch you next week.